In the isolated mountains of Kentucky, an inn once stood where the wilderness road cut its perilous path toward the western frontier. It was a place travelers discussed in quiet, respectful whispers. They claimed Millbrook Inn delivered an experience no other establishment could offer, a kind of warmth that extended well beyond comfortable beds and warm food. This mountain refuge was managed by 4 sisters, and exhausted men who came as strangers would depart feeling as though they'd found something priceless, something that justified the difficult journey to return. The reputation of the Cunningham sisters was known across the expanse of 3 states. Businessmen would willingly postpone their professional travel just to stay a few extra nights at Millbrook Inn. Drovers would choose risky detours over hostile mountain passes before they would pass up the chance to enjoy the sisters' legendary welcome. Those who had stayed there described comforts that lonely men on the road seldom encountered. The attention they received was so personal and intimate that grown men often wept when their departure time arrived. However, a change occurred in the winter of 1851. Travelers started showing up in settlements all over Kentucky telling unsettling stories. They insisted that the route to Millbrook Inn had become strewn with abandoned wagons and horses without riders. Initially, local authorities wrote off these accounts as frontier anxieties, but a pattern soon developed that they could no longer overlook. A significant number of men, numbering in the dozens, had disappeared without a single clue, and the last known location where anyone recalled seeing them was on the winding mountain trail leading to the inviting entrance of the Cunningham Sisters Inn. Before we proceed with the story of what truly transpired in those remote Kentucky mountains, I have a request for you. Please click the subscribe button and activate the notification bell. You will not want to let stories such as this one pass you by. Also, let me know in the comments which state you are listening from. I enjoy making connections with listeners from all over the nation who have the same fascination with America's hidden histories as I do. The discovery that authorities were on the verge of making would show that the comfort travelers experienced at Millbrook Inn carried a cost much more horrifying than any of them could have foreseen. The year was 1831 when Jeremiah Cunningham died from consumption, leaving his thriving mountain estate and 4 daughters aged 16 to 26 behind. Situated in the secluded highlands between the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia and the Kentucky frontier, the Cunningham land covered 800 acres of rich mountain terrain, featuring livestock, crop fields, and most critically, a strategically placed inn for travelers making their way west on the wilderness road. Margaret, the oldest at 26, had the sharp intellect of a natural businesswoman and a cold, methodical disposition that would later prove to be so lethal. Catherine, 24, had received her mother's otherworldly beauty, along with an almost magical talent for making any man believe he was the most significant person alive. Sarah, 22, held her late mother's understanding of mountain herbs and their diverse effects, knowledge that would turn out to be far more malevolent than was conceivable. Lastly, Elizabeth, at 16, the youngest, had a natural, innocent charm that could put even the most wary traveler at ease. The Cunningham estate was originally established by their grandfather in 1798, back when the wilderness road was barely more than a hazardous trail cut through dangerous lands. By 1831, it had grown to become one of the most esteemed resting places for merchants, pioneers, and thrill-seekers. Was on their way to the promise of Kentucky's bluegrass region. The main residence, a large 2-story log building with stone foundations, was positioned prominently on a ridge with a view of the valley below. The inn section comprised 6 pleasant guest rooms, a spacious common room featuring enormous stone fireplaces, and a kitchen with the capacity to serve dozens of people. What set the Cunningham establishment apart was not merely its location or its features, it was the legacy of hospitality that had been meticulously nurtured for 3 decades. In towns hundreds of miles away, travelers would praise the warmth of the Cunningham welcome, the excellence of their mountain whiskey, and the solace of clean beds after spending weeks on dangerous roads. Jeremiah had created something more precious than gold: trust. The property had a small but devoted staff. A weathered mountain man in his 50s named Ezra Hawthorne had been the foreman since the inn's earliest years. His command of mountain knowledge was exhaustive, and his devotion to the Cunningham family was unwavering. The Zimmer brothers, Klaus and Heinrich, two German immigrants, had shown up 3 years prior looking for employment and security in the New World. They resided in a cabin close to the eastern edge of the property and oversaw the livestock and farming operations with German precision. The fall of 1831 signaled the start of what the local people would later call the Inn's Golden Era. The sisters, who at first collaborated out of pure need, soon realized they had a unique gift for making their guests feel not only accommodated but truly treasured. The business was kept profitable by Margaret's sharp financial sense. Guests were enticed to stay longer than they intended by Catherine's charm. Their reputation for comfort was bolstered by Sarah's skill in mountain cooking and herbal teas, while Elizabeth's youthful energy brought a smile to even the most exhausted travelers. Yet, a more sinister element was developing beneath this veneer of mountain generosity. The very isolation that had previously shielded the Cunningham family from the threats of frontier existence now offered something completely different: privacy. And for 4 clever young women with few moral reservations, privacy could indeed be a very dangerous asset. It was on a November evening in 1832 that Thomas Kellerman came to Millbrook Inn, bringing with him the initial sign of the impending darkness. Kellerman was a cattle dealer from Richmond, making his journey alone with a large pouch of gold coins meant for acquisitions in Kentucky. He was a 45-year-old man, a recent widower without any children or strong connections, exactly the kind of guest the sisters would later become terrifyingly adept at spotting. The air temperature had fallen below freezing, and a gentle snow had started to drift down as Kellerman's horse made its way up the twisting path to the inn. Margaret met him at the entrance with her well-rehearsed smile, instantly observing the fine quality of his attire, the heaviness of his saddlebags, and, most crucially, the look of loneliness in his eyes. A man traveling by himself just a year after his wife's passing was burdened by more than just his money. He was also carrying an intense longing for human connection. "Welcome to Millbrook Inn," Margaret greeted him, her tone a perfect blend of professional courtesy and warmth. "I am Margaret Cunningham, and these are my sisters. We will see to it that your stay is precisely what you need it to be." Kellerman's expression lifted as he absorbed the inviting glow of the common area, the aroma of Sarah's venison stew, and the image of Catherine arranging fresh wildflowers despite the time of year. This was the exact environment a lonely widower required, a place where beautiful, caring women would embrace him like family instead of just another guest paying for or a room. Over the subsequent 3 days, the sisters gave Kellerman a level of hospitality he had never before experienced at any inn. Sarah's cooking produced restaurant-level banquets that included exquisitely seasoned game, freshly baked bread, and her renowned honey cakes. Margaret drew him into long discussions on business and politics, which made him feel intellectually respected. His own stories were met with Elizabeth's guileless laughter, making him feel worldly and significant. However, it was Catherine who delivered what Kellerman truly yearned for, the semblance of a romance. On his second night there, Catherine found Kellerman sitting by himself near the fire after the other guests had gone to bed, gazing into the flames with the vacant look of a man who had lost all that was important to him. With 2 glasses of Sarah's special spiced rum, she came toward him, the crystal tumblers warming perfectly and glinting in the firelight. "You appear to be troubled, Mr. Kellerman," she remarked, gracefully sinking into the chair next to him. "Sometimes a burden becomes lighter when it is shared." For the following 2 hours, Kellerman found himself revealing his innermost feelings to this stunning woman, who listened with such sincere focus. He talked about his late wife, Mary, their unsuccessful efforts to have children, and the experience of coming home each night to a vacant house that still carried the faint scent of her lavender soap. Catherine listened with flawless empathy, at times touching his hand or moving closer with what seemed to be genuine compassion. "Loneliness is a dreadful thing," she murmured gently as the fire waned, "but it is not something that has to last forever." Whatever transpired after that was not recorded in any official files, yet Kellerman's demeanor the next morning was its own testament. He went about breakfast with the fulfilled look of someone who had found new reasons to live. He extended his visit by an extra 2 Days, despite his initial rush to get to Kentucky. Most revealingly, he started making arrangements for a return visit to Millbrook Inn during his trip back home to Richmond. "I have never known hospitality of this kind," he declared to Margaret as he readied himself to depart. "You and your sisters have built something genuinely exceptional here. I plan to recommend this establishment to every traveler I encounter." Margaret smiled and took his generous payment, which was almost twice the usual charge, offered to her with sincere appreciation. "We will anticipate your return, Mr. Kellerman. Have a safe journey." Thomas Kellerman, however, would never arrive in Kentucky. His horse was discovered 3 days later, wandering without a rider near the Cumberland Gap. Kellerman himself had disappeared completely, leaving behind nothing but unanswered questions and a puzzle that would not be formally explored. The conclusion, which was reasonable enough on the perilous frontier, was that he had been a victim of bandits or wild creatures. The truth was known only to the Cunningham sisters. Heinrich Zimmer had been positioned in the woods about a half-mile from the inn as Kellerman left that morning. The German immigrant was skilled with tools and had a quiet effectiveness that made him indispensable for tasks needing discretion. Kellerman did not see the strike that took his life, which was dealt with a blacksmith's hammer to the back of his head. His corpse was shrouded in canvas and interred at a pre-planned spot deep within the mountain woods, while his large pouch of gold coins was returned to Millbrook Inn. That evening, the four sisters gathered around their kitchen table, counting Kellerman's money and mapping out their future. Margaret had performed the math. The sum they had just obtained was more than the inn's legitimate earnings for a full year. Catherine had shown that lonely men could be swayed with surprising simplicity. Sarah had proven that any sign of evidence could be wiped out if one had the right understanding of chemistry and mountain survival skills, and Elizabeth had demonstrated that even the most seemingly harmless individual could hold on to dreadful secrets. "He will not be missed for several weeks," Margaret stated, stacking the gold coins with a businesslike efficiency. "He has no family, no close friends, and is traveling alone to a place where he is unknown. Perfect." Catherine, still displaying the same gentle demeanor she had used to console their victim, added, "It was almost too simple. He would have given us whatever we requested." What they had realized on that chilly November night was an asset far more precious than gold. They had realized how to make people vanish. The winter of 1832 provided the sisters with the opportunity to polish their methods and lay down the procedures that would be effective for nearly 2 decades. Margaret, with her sharp business sense, created a method for spotting the best targets. A man traveling by himself, carrying a significant amount of money, with minimal family ties and no strict itinerary that would cause immediate concern if he didn't show up at his destination, was the ideal victim. Sarah's responsibilities grew beyond just cooking and managing the household. Her familiarity with mountain flora was broadened to encompass a thorough investigation of poisons and their consequences. Pokeweed berries with the right preparation could bring on symptoms that mimicked cholera. Foxglove was able to induce heart failure that looked natural. Water hemlock could be lethal within a few hours, leaving behind very little evidence. She started a concealed garden behind the main residence to grow these plants next to harmless herbs, thus building a pharmaceutical arsenal that was camouflaged as a medicinal patch. Catherine mastered the skill of emotional manipulation, becoming adept at discerning men's deepest desires and positioning herself as the solution to their solitude. She observed her targets with great care, altering her own persona to align with their wishes. She would become deeply religious for the pious man. For the intellectual, she would shift into a well-informed conversationalist. She provided solace and empathy for those who were grieving. Her capacity to transform into whatever a man required was simultaneously her most powerful tool and her most disturbing skill. Elizabeth, in spite of her youth, was essential to the success of the operation. Her seemingly authentic innocence acted as a perfect disguise for the family's undertakings. Guests with suspicions found it impossible to stay on guard around a girl who appeared to be incapable of any trickery. She also functioned as the initial alert system. Her naturally affable nature enabled her to gather details about guests' histories, travel itineraries, and financial status without arousing any suspicion. The logistics of body disposal were managed with German precision by the Zimmer brothers. Klaus had found a network of natural caves on the mountainside, which could only be reached through a hidden opening behind a rockslide. Bodies could be transported there in the dark and concealed behind loose rocks, where the mountain's chemistry would speed up the process of decay. Personal belongings were meticulously sorted, all valuable items were retained, whereas anything that could be used to identify the victim was buried in a separate location or destroyed. Ezra Hawthorne's part in the operation was arguably the most vital. In the local area, his reputation was impeccable, and his statements were taken seriously by the authorities. On the rare occasions when inquiries were made about missing travelers, Ezra would gravel. "I state that the person had indeed been a guest at Millbrook Inn, but had left in excellent health and high spirits." His weathered features and sincere manner had always successfully reassured even the most persistent questioner. The spring of 1833 delivered their next victim, a tobacco merchant from North Carolina named William Fraser. Fraser was carrying close to $500 in silver coins, which were the earnings from a prosperous season of crop sales. He was a 38-year-old bachelor, known for his solitary habits and his custom of taking business trips alone to prevent sharing his earnings with any partners. Fraser showed up on a wet April evening and was immediately captivated by the warmth and comfort of the inn. After enduring weeks of difficult travel, the sisters executed their refined plan with absolute precision. Margaret talked with him about business, discovering his financial state and travel schedule. Sarah served him outstanding meals that made him hesitant to resume his trip. Elizabeth charmed him with piano performances and a guileless personality that brought to mind the daughter he never had. Yet it was Catherine who ultimately determined Fraser's destiny. On his third evening at the inn, she discovered him reading by himself in the main room with a leather-bound book of poetry resting on his lap. She came to him with a display of shyness, inquiring if he would mind reading out loud, explaining that while she lacked formal education, she adored the melody of beautiful language. For a period of 2 hours, Fraser read to Catherine by the light of a lamp, his voice becoming stronger and more self-assured as she listened with rapt attention. When he was done, she laid her hand gently on his arm and said that he possessed the most beautiful voice she had ever encountered. The solitude that had encrusted Fraser's heart for years started to give way. "I've never encountered anyone like you," he said to her, his voice heavy with feelings he had long held back. "You make me feel as if I'm alive again." "In that case, don't depart tomorrow," Catherine answered, her gaze reflecting the lamplight with a perfectly feigned sincerity. "Remain for one more day. Allow me to hear you read once more." Fraser prolonged his visit for a full week, during which time Catherine progressively intensified their closeness while Sarah started adding small quantities of pokeweed extract to his tea each evening. The effect started subtly with minor stomach pain and a bit of lightheadedness, nothing sufficiently alarming to trigger immediate worry. Fraser chalked up his discomfort to the pressures of his journey and the emotional turmoil from his newfound romantic feelings. On his last evening at Millbrook Inn, Catherine asked Fraser to have a private dinner with her in her room. Sarah had cooked his preferred meal and provided a bottle of wine that was spiked with a meticulously measured amount of water hemlock extract. As Fraser sat opposite Catherine in the soft candlelight, confessing his aspirations and worries to a woman he thought might completely alter his life, he was oblivious to the fact that he was already in the process of dying. The poison took effect precisely as Sarah had foreseen. Fraser's death looked like an abrupt heart attack, induced by excitement and overstimulation. His body was found the following morning in Catherine's bed, seemingly having passed away calmly in his sleep after a night of intimacy. Had a doctor even been on hand to inspect the body, the symptoms were a perfect match for those of a natural cardiac arrest in a middle-aged man who had led a mostly inactive life. Fraser was laid to rest with suitable reverence in the inn's small burial ground, a final detail that Margaret had incorporated into their scheme. A formal grave, complete with a carved marker, created the illusion of dignified handling while in reality serving as the ideal concealment. The cemetery held the graves of multiple generations of the Cunningham family, which made any new burial seem ordinary to local onlookers. Fraser's money and valuable personal items were added to the sisters' expanding hoard, while his wagon and horses were sold to merchants traveling through several weeks later. His vanishing was explained as a choice to make a new life in Kentucky instead of going back to North Carolina, an acceptable story that no one bothered to question too deeply. By the conclusion of 1833, the sisters had developed a system that was practically impossible to trace. They had figured out how to space their crimes out, making sure to never target more than 4 or 5 individuals a year to prevent establishing patterns that could draw unwanted scrutiny. They created cover stories for guests who passed away at the inn, with explanations varying from heart attacks and accidents to choices to move permanently to the West. Above all, they learned to have complete faith in one another, forming a conspiracy so secure that not even the faintest clue about their actions ever got out. Just when it seemed we had witnessed the worst, the horror at Millbrook Inn escalates. If this narrative is sending shivers down your spine, pass this video along to a friend who enjoys dark mysteries. Show your support for our content by hitting the like button, and make sure to subscribe so you never miss out on stories like this one. Let's find out together what unfolds next, because the Cunningham sisters were only just beginning. Between the years 1834 and 1845, Millbrook Inn earned a reputation that was known throughout the mid-Atlantic area and even further. It was discussed by travelers with the same deep respect usually reserved for the most prestigious places in Richmond or Baltimore. The sisters had managed to build something unheard of, a secluded mountain inn that offered opulent lodging and a level of service that could compete with the finest city hotels. Margaret had greatly broadened their legitimate business activities. The inn now kept a stable of high-quality horses for its guests, ran a small distillery that made top-shelf mountain whiskey, and even provided guided hunting trips personally led by Ezra Hawthorne. These lawful ventures brought in a considerable amount of money and, more crucially, established the sisters' reputation as shrewd businesswomen rather than mere innkeepers. The guest log from this time, meticulously kept in the Virginia State Archives, recounts the tale of their prosperity. In Margaret's graceful handwriting, merchants from Charleston, politicians from Richmond, land developers from Baltimore, and adventurers from as far as Boston all signed their names. A large number of them came back repeatedly, becoming regular customers who sang the praises of Millbrook Inn to their associates and acquaintances. Yet concealed beneath this legitimate prosperity was a finely tuned killing operation that ran with the precision of a clock. The sisters had honed their method of choosing victims into an exact science. Catherine acquired an almost uncanny knack for spotting the men who would never be reported missing, the loners, the social misfits, those with secrets that led them to shun close connections. Sarah's command of poisons had grown to include a wide array of plant and mineral-based toxins, each with its own set of symptoms and methods of detection. Elizabeth had become adept at drawing out detailed personal histories from guests through conversations that seemed entirely innocent, while Margaret managed the entire operation with the accuracy of a military strategist. In this period, they took the lives of roughly 43 individuals, the precise count later discovered by the railroad surveyor. Every killing was meticulously organized and carried out based on strict procedures that minimized danger and maximized financial gain. The sisters compiled thorough dossiers on their targets, at times monitoring potential victims for weeks before they made their final choice. Take the instance of Jonathan Waverly, a land surveyor from Pennsylvania, who showed up in September of 1838. Waverly was performing mapping tasks for the state government, a position that necessitated him to travel by himself through isolated regions for months on end. He was carrying survey instruments of considerable value, along with his payment for the job and money to buy land parcels he had marked as potential investments. Margaret instantly saw Waverly as a perfect target. His job required long periods away from civilization, which meant his absence might not be detected for months. His surveying work offered an ideal explanation for his disappearance. He could have easily met his end through any of a number of natural dangers while working alone in hazardous terrain. More critically, his somewhat reserved nature indicated he had few close friends who would launch an inquiry if he did not return. The sisters started their plan right away. Sarah cooked special dishes with game that Waverley had seen Ezra hunt, forging a link between the meal and the rugged mountain setting he found so captivating. Elizabeth drew him into talks about his mapping project, feigning a deep interest in his technical skills and making him feel valued for his knowledge. Margaret talked with him about possible land purchases, presenting herself as a local authority who could guide him toward lucrative finds. However, it was Catherine who delivered the final element that sealed Waverley's fate. She did not approach him as a potential love interest, but rather as a kindred soul who also cherished the untamed wilderness. She displayed a seemingly vast knowledge of the mountain's plants and animals, which she had acquired through years of diligent study that, in reality, supported her poison research. She joined him on brief surveying trips around the inn's land, showing a level of comfort in the outdoors that Waverley found captivating. "I have never encountered a woman who grasps the mountains as you do," Waverley admitted to her during one of their trips, his professional composure finally giving way. "Most people only perceive a wilderness, but you are able to see the underlying beauty and structure." "I have spent my entire life here," Catherine answered, moving nearer to him as they stood on a ridge that looked out over the valley. "The mountains have imparted lessons to me that could never be learned from books, lessons about life, about death, and the equilibrium between them." Waverley extended his intended 2-day visit to 3 weeks, officially to carry out more detailed survey work in the vicinity, but in reality, because he had become completely captivated by Catherine. Throughout this period, Sarah systematically added increasingly stronger poisons to his food, inducing symptoms that resembled the initial phases of mountain fever, a real danger that had taken the lives of several surveyors in previous years. The poison Sarah administered to Waverley was a creation of her own, an extract from destroying angel mushrooms that causes liver failure over a span of several days. The symptoms were a perfect match for those of mountain fever, and it's unlikely that even a seasoned physician could have told the difference between the two conditions. Waverley's passing looked like a sad but completely foreseeable risk of his profession. His surveying tools were sold to a merchant in Kentucky, and his comprehensive maps were added to Margaret's expanding collection of information on the area's geography and resources. His body was placed with the others in Town. He sealed mountain caves, and his name was recorded in local logs as just another person who fell victim to the perilous frontier way of life. The genius of the sisters' operation was not only in their methods of killing but also in their skill at upholding an appearance of decency. They were present at church services in the nearby town of Millbrook, gave generously to community initiatives, and kept up friendships with local families. Margaret was a member of the board for the Regional Merchants Association, while Sarah gave medical help to neighboring farms when there was sickness. Catherine instructed local children in Sunday school, and Elizabeth planned social gatherings that united isolated mountain families. This engagement in the community had several benefits. It gave them alibis and character references for times when inquiries about missing guests might arise. It provided them with access to details about people traveling through the area. Most crucially, it cemented their status as cornerstones of the community, whose statements would never be doubted by the local authorities. The sisters also cultivated a broad network of business connections that helped to legitimize their accumulating wealth. They put money into land acquisitions all over the area, steadily building a collection of properties that brought in rental income and grew in value. They provided loans to local farmers and businessmen, which earned them both interest income and sway in the community. They even bought stock in a few riverboat companies that operated on the Ohio River, thereby diversifying their investments and creating more streams of revenue. By the year 1845, the Cunningham sisters were counted among the most affluent landowners in Western Virginia. Their story of success was presented as a model of what determined women could accomplish, even in the difficult environment of the frontier. Local papers would occasionally run articles on the enterprising Cunningham sisters, who had successfully built a prosperous business empire from the mountain property they inherited. Yet, beneath this veneer of legitimate achievement lay the meticulously hidden remains of over 40 men who had made the deadly error of accepting the sisters' hospitality. Every death had contributed to their fortune and refined their techniques, establishing a cycle of murder and gain that appeared impossible to halt or uncover. The seclusion that had once shielded them from being found now offered something even more precious, the ideal setting for their predatory actions. Millbrook Inn had transformed into a spider's web, appearing beautiful and welcoming on the outside, but lethal to any who were caught in its threads. The start of their downfall came not from the authorities or from suspicious family members, but from an unforeseen source, one of their own staff. Heinrich Zimmer, the younger of the two German brothers, had become progressively more erratic after a hunting mishap in the autumn of 1849 left him with persistent pain and a reliance on laudanum for relief. Heinrich had always been the more sensitive of the Zimmer siblings, and the years of being involved in the sisters' criminal activities had exacted a mental toll that his brother Klaus either disregarded or didn't notice. The laudanum, which Sarah had first given him for valid pain management, slowly turned into Heinrich's means of escaping the guilt and the nightmares that disturbed his sleep. However, this addiction created its own set of issues: paranoia, abrupt mood changes, and a tendency for careless talk, which made him an increasing risk to the entire operation. The breaking point arrived on a frigid February morning in 1850 when Heinrich showed up at the kitchen entrance of the main house, his eyes wild with a drug-fueled panic and his attire in disarray from a night without sleep. Sarah was by herself in the kitchen making breakfast for a merchant from North Carolina who had checked in the previous night, a man the sisters had already singled out as their next victim. "I can't continue doing this," Heinrich murmured, his voice trembling with feeling. "I see their faces each and every night. Whenever I shut my eyes, they are all there, staring at me. 43 men, Sarah. 43 souls demanding justice." Sarah kept her cool, but her thoughts were racing as she assessed the danger that Heinrich now posed. He had complete and detailed knowledge of their crimes. He could lead the authorities to the exact locations of the burial spots, provide descriptions of the murder techniques, and give testimony that would lead all 4 sisters to the gallows. "You are not feeling well, Heinrich," she said in a gentle tone, moving toward him with what seemed like concern. "The laudanum is playing tricks on your mind. You are imagining things that are not there." "No." Heinrich's voice escalated dangerously, and Sarah looked up at the ceiling, hoping the guest in the room above had not been disturbed. "I am aware of what we have done. I am aware of what you have forced me to do, and I know that it needs to end." The discussion went on for close to an hour, with Heinrich swinging between tearful admissions and furious accusations, while Sarah made efforts to soothe him without alerting the rest of the house. She finally succeeded in persuading him to go back to his cabin, with the assurance that they would address the matter later, once he had had a chance to rest and think more clearly. But Sarah was aware that there would be no later discussion. Heinrich Zimmer had turned into a risk that jeopardized everything they had established, and risks needed to be removed. That night, after their guest had gone to bed, Sarah cooked a special meal for the Zimmer brothers, explaining to Klaus that it was a token of gratitude for their years of faithful service. The dinner included Heinrich's favorite foods, along with Sarah's special spiced wine, which was laced with enough concentrated foxglove extract to make a man's heart stop within a few hours. Heinrich passed away peacefully in his sleep that night. His death was blamed on the same heart issue that had supposedly taken the lives of several of their guests over the years. Klaus, who had drunk less of the poisoned wine due to his naturally moderate habits, managed to survive but was left with serious heart damage that made him weak and reliant on Sarah's medical attention. The death of Heinrich dealt with their immediate issue, but it also brought about new difficulties. Klaus, even with his physical frailty, started to ask sharp questions about his brother's unexpected death. He had noticed the parallels between Heinrich's symptoms and those shown by several of their guests, and his allegiance to the sisters was weakening under the pressure of his suspicions and sorrow. Margaret saw that their operation was moving into a precarious stage. The web of trust and involvement that had shielded them for almost 2 decades was starting to fray, and any major inquiry would reveal evidence that even their substantial power could not hide. She started to formulate backup plans in case they had to abandon Millbrook Inn. The last guest to meet his end at Millbrook Inn was a cotton broker from Savannah named Samuel Hartwell, who showed up in March 1851 carrying more than $1,000 in gold coins and paper money. Hartwell was a widower in his 50s, making his way north to arrange deals with textile factories in Pennsylvania. His death followed the sisters' usual method, an apparent heart failure after several days of extraordinary hospitality that featured close companionship with Catherine. Yet Hartwell's death represented a critical shift in the sisters' approach, and for the first time in nearly 20 years they made North Carolina, who had checked in the previous night, a man the sisters had already singled out as their next victim. "I can't continue doing this," Heinrich murmured, his voice trembling with feeling. "I see their faces each and every night. Whenever I shut my eyes, they are all there, staring at me. 43 men, Sarah. 43 souls demanding justice." Sarah kept her cool, but her thoughts were racing as she assessed the danger that Heinrich now posed. He had complete and detailed knowledge of their crimes. He could lead the authorities to the exact locations of the burial spots, provide descriptions of the murder techniques, and give testimony that would lead all 4 sisters to the gallows. "You are not feeling well, Heinrich," she said in a gentle tone, moving toward him with what seemed like concern. "The laudanum is playing tricks on your mind. You are imagining things that are not there." "No." Heinrich's voice escalated dangerously, and Sarah looked up at the ceiling, hoping the guest in the room above had not been disturbed. "I am aware of what we have done. I am aware of what you have forced me to do, and I know that it needs to end." The discussion went on for close to an hour, with Heinrich swinging between tearful admissions and furious accusations, while Sarah made efforts to soothe him without alerting the rest of the house. She finally succeeded in persuading him to go back to his cabin, with the assurance that they would address the matter later, once he had had a chance to rest and think more clearly. But Sarah was aware that there would be no later discussion. Heinrich Zimmer had turned into a risk that jeopardized everything they had established, and risks needed to be removed. That night, after their guest had gone to bed, Sarah cooked a special meal for the Zimmer brothers, explaining to Klaus that it was a token of gratitude for their years of faithful service. The dinner included Heinrich's favorite foods, along with Sarah's special spiced wine, which was laced with enough concentrated foxglove extract to make a man's heart stop within a few hours. Heinrich passed away peacefully in his sleep that night. His death was blamed on the same heart issue that had supposedly taken the lives of several of their guests over the years. Klaus, who had drunk less of the poisoned wine due to his naturally moderate habits, managed to survive but was left with serious heart damage that made him weak and reliant on Sarah's medical attention. The death of Heinrich dealt with their immediate issue, but it also brought about new difficulties. Klaus, even with his physical frailty, started to ask sharp questions about his brother's unexpected death. He had noticed the parallels between Heinrich's symptoms and those shown by several of their guests, and his allegiance to the sisters was weakening under the pressure of his suspicions and sorrow. Margaret saw that their operation was moving into a precarious stage. The web of trust and involvement that had shielded them for almost 2 decades was starting to fray, and any major inquiry would reveal evidence that even their substantial power could not hide. She started to formulate backup plans in case they had to abandon Millbrook Inn. The last guest to meet his end at Millbrook Inn was a cotton broker from Savannah named Samuel Hartwell, who showed up in March 1851 carrying more than $1,000 in gold coins and paper money. Hartwell was a widower in his 50s, making his way north to arrange deals with textile factories in Pennsylvania. His death followed the sisters' usual method, an apparent heart failure after several days of extraordinary hospitality that featured close companionship with Catherine. Yet Hartwell's death represented a critical shift in the sisters' approach, and for the first time in nearly 20 years they made case could involve crimes that crossed state lines. The sisters reacted to the arrival of the police with their usual self-control. Margaret met Brennan at the main entrance with a polite show of concern, stating her hope that she could help with whatever inquiry had led him to their property. Catherine seemed truly upset at the idea that anything inappropriate could have happened at their well-respected establishment. Sarah offered to make coffee for the officers while Elizabeth looked bewildered and scared by the accusations being made against her family. However, their well-rehearsed acts could not hide the physical proof that 20 years of murder had accumulated. The search of the main house turned up several objects that were clearly the property of missing travelers: a unique silver pocket watch with Samuel Hartwell's initials engraved on it, a leather case holding business papers that belonged to Thomas Kellerman, and an assortment of personal letters and photos that were linked to dozens of different victims. Even more incriminating was Sarah's meticulously tended garden of poisonous plants, which contained several types that had no valid medical use. Her library of books on botany and chemistry showed a level of knowledge in toxicology that was far beyond what was needed for simple household remedies. Concealed in her private room, investigators discovered detailed notes that outlined the effects and proper amounts of different plant-based poisons, along with records that were clearly tied to the deaths of particular guests. The finding of the burial caves was the last piece of evidence required to establish the full extent of the sisters' crimes. Klaus, who was facing charges of being an accessory to murder, guided the investigators to the hidden entrance behind the rock slide. Inside the caves, just as the railroad surveyor would discover them months later, here the skeletal remains of 43 men, along with personal items valued at thousands of dollars. Each set of bones recounted its own tale of a violent end. Puncture marks found at the base of several skulls suggested that some victims had been dispatched swiftly with sharp objects, most likely while they were rendered unconscious by poison or alcohol. Others displayed evidence of strangulation or suffocation. A small number seemed to have succumbed to poison alone, as their bones revealed the chemical alterations linked to heavy metal poisoning. The trial of the Cunningham sisters turned into one of the most widely publicized legal events in Virginia's history. Newspapers all over the nation reported on the case, captivated by the tale of 4 women who had run one of the most successful criminal operations in the history of America. The prosecution, headed by Commonwealth Attorney Daniel Hutchinson, laid out a mountain of evidence of a conspiracy that had spanned almost 20 years and resulted in more than 40 deaths. Throughout the entire trial, Margaret insisted on her innocence, asserting that any evidence discovered at the inn was planted by rivals who wanted to ruin her family's good name. Catherine had a complete breakdown during her testimony, swinging between denials and tearful admissions that incriminated all 4 sisters in the murders. Sarah chose not to speak at all, keeping a stoic silence that was widely seen as a confession of guilt. Elizabeth, the youngest and most sympathetic of the defendants, claimed that she had been forced into participating by her older sisters and pleaded with the court for leniency. The defense's approach centered on the isolation and vulnerability of 4 orphaned women attempting to make a living in a harsh frontier setting. Marcus Fairfield, the sisters' lawyer, contended that they had been pushed to extreme actions by situation as they couldn't control, and that their youth and gender should be taken into account as mitigating factors during sentencing. However, the sheer weight of the evidence and the shocking scale of their crimes made it hard for any sympathy to last. The jury took less than 3 hours to come back with guilty verdicts for all 4 defendants on numerous charges of first-degree murder. The sentencing was quick and decisive. Margaret, Catherine, and Sarah were sentenced to be hanged, with their execution set for October 12, 1851. Elizabeth, mostly because of her age when the crime started and her seeming cooperation with the law, was given a sentence of life in prison with no chance of parole. The executions took place as planned on a bleak October morning, with a crowd of hundreds gathering to see the final chapter of the Cunningham sisters' story. Margaret met her end with the same cool-headedness she had maintained throughout the trial, not offering any last words of regret or justification. Catherine and Sarah stood side by side on the gallows, holding hands as the nooses were slipped over their necks. Their final display of sisterly unity was a sharp contrast to the calculated heartlessness they had shown their victims. Elizabeth Cunningham was taken to the Virginia State Penitentiary in Richmond, where she was to live out the next 37 years of her life. Prison documents show that she asserted her innocence right up until her death in 1888, stating over and over that she had been a pawn in her sister's schemes rather than a willing collaborator in their crimes. She was never visited by anyone and did not leave behind any written record of her time at Millbrook Inn. Klaus Zimmer, who was given immunity for his testimony, vanished soon after the trial ended. There were some accounts that placed him in Ohio and others in Missouri, but he was never officially found. The shock of his brother's death and his part in Brin's Jing, the sister's crimes to light, seemed to have shattered him completely, leaving him unable to put down roots anywhere or to build any lasting connections. Ezra Hawthorne was charged as an accessory to murder, but his old age and his help with the authorities resulted in a lighter sentence of 10 years in prison. He passed away in jail in 1854, reportedly still claiming that he had never known the true extent of the sisters' actions and had always believed their reasons for the various deaths and disappearances. Millbrook Inn itself was sold off at an auction to cover the legal debts of the Cunningham estate. The new proprietors, a family from Richmond named Fletcher, tried to keep it running as a legitimate inn, but the property's infamous history made it impossible to draw in any guests. The building remained vacant for a number of years until it was bought by a mining company that tore down the structures and repurposed the land for industrial activities. The copper mine where the victims' bodies were found was permanently closed off by a court order, and a plain stone marker was put up to honor the 43 men who lost their lives at Millbrook Inn. The marker, which local historical societies say is still there today, simply reads, "Here lie unknown travelers, 1832 to 1851. May they find the peace in death that was denied them in life." The case had widespread effects on the regulation of inns and hotels across Virginia and the states bordering it. New legislation was passed that mandated more thorough guest check-in processes, compulsory notification of guest deaths to local law enforcement, and routine checks of businesses that cater to travelers. The Cunningham laws, as they came to be called, were enforced well into the 20th century. What is perhaps most noteworthy is that the Millbrook Inn case turned into a warning story about the risks of seclusion and the potential for wickedness to thrive in areas far from the watch of civilized society. Criminal investigators started to look more closely at trends of disappearances near isolated establishments, which several smaller-scale operations that might have otherwise gone on without being caught. The financial inquiry brought to light the true scale of the sisters' success. Their estate, which included land, business investments, and cash, was estimated to be worth more than $50,000, a staggering sum for that era. The funds were used to pay compensation to the victims' families where feasible and to finance upgrades to law enforcement resources in the remote parts of Virginia. Modern criminologists who have examined the case point to several elements that played a part in the sisters' extraordinary success. Their operations skillfully blended careful target selection, advanced killing techniques, excellent disposal methods, and most critically, a flawless cover story that rendered their crimes almost undetectable to the investigators of their time. The remoteness of their location offered seclusion for their actions, while their reputation for hospitality ensured a continuous supply of potential victims. The psychological profiles created by contemporary experts indicate that Margaret was the main planner of the operation. She had the antisocial personality traits and organizational abilities needed to devise and carry out such a multifaceted criminal scheme. Catherine likely had what is now known as borderline personality disorder, which enabled her to create strong but ultimately hollow emotional bonds with her victims. Sarah's proficiency with poisons points to a preoccupation with death and control that was verging on sadistic. The part played by Elizabeth is still the most unclear. It may never be known for certain whether she was a willing collaborator or a coerced accessory. What makes the Millbrook Inn case so particularly disturbing is how easily it might have carried on without end. If Heinrich Zimmer had not experienced his mental collapse, or if Sheriff Brennan had been less determined in his inquiry, the sisters could have potentially continued their actions for many more decades. The arbitrary nature of their eventual exposure is a sobering reminder that many historical crimes may have remained completely undiscovered, with their perpetrators taking their secrets with them to unmarked graves. The tale of the Cunningham sisters also underscores the vulnerability of people traveling in the era before industrialization. At a time when communication was slow and travel was perilous, a man could vanish between two towns and not be reported missing for months, if at all. The sisters took advantage of this weakness with merciless effectiveness, transforming the hospitality industry itself into a tool to be used against the lonely and the isolated. Local legends in Western Virginia have kept distorted accounts of the Millbrook Inn story alive for generations. Some versions depicted the sisters as victims of their situation, forced into desperate acts by poverty and remoteness. Others changed them into supernatural beings who tempted their victims with magic rather than simple deception. The reality, as shown by court documents and first-hand accounts, is at once more ordinary and more horrifying than any ghost tale. The actual site of Millbrook Inn remained a source of local superstition long into the 20th century. Hunters and hikers claim to have found strange items in the vicinity: old buttons, scraps of fabric, rusted metal pieces that could have once been the property of the sisters' victims. It is still unknown whether these findings were authentic relics or merely the creations of vivid imaginations shaped by the location's notorious past. Over the years, several efforts were made to find other burial spots that might hold victims who were disposed of in different ways. Ground-penetrating radar scans performed in the 1980s showed a number of soil irregularities that were consistent with unmarked graves, but legal and ethical issues stood in the way of any large-scale digging. There is still a chance that the 43 victims